everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast. Panel discussion, VA Genomics, the clinic and research, presented by Dr. Laurence Meyer, Chief Officer in Specialty Care Services, Veteran Health Administration, and Dr. Ronald Przygodzki, Director of Genomic Medicine and Implementation, Department of Veteran Affairs. I am Kaylee Bach of LabRoots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want at any time you want during the presentation. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen, type your questions into the drop-down box, and hit send. We'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please click on the Help Desk button located in the promotional board at the bottom center of your screen, or use the Ask a Question box to let us know that you're having a problem. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located in the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laurence Meyer and Dr. Ronald Przygodzki. I will now turn the presentation over to them.
Hi, my name is Ron Przygodzki. I am in research development at VA, and my co-presenter is Laurence Meyer, who is in the clinical side of the VHA healthcare system. We'd like to present the general view of where genomic medicine is and hopefully moving into in the future within the VA healthcare system itself. I'll present a couple of pieces from the research elements, and Larry will certainly present the clinical piece in a few seconds here. I think what's important to bring up is that VA research development has been around for several decades and has produced a lot of great works that not only help the veteran, but general population writ large. Some examples, Harold Back S. Many decades looking at streptomycin and tuberculosis treatment, the nicotine patch, pacemaker, treatment for hypertension, the like, and several others that are ongoing at this point as well. But what's important to stress is that we have, I think, an ideal setting for large-scale population research, because we are embedded within the healthcare system itself, and we have the access to medical record data that goes back as far as 20 years, as well as other records information that could be linked with the given individual. I think what's important also to stress is that after the Second World War, Omar Bradley came up with the idea that we need to have affiliate as well as research put into the healthcare of the Veterans Administration, as it was called back then. And because of that, we have a lot of clinician researchers that are benefiting and helping in tandem with the given patient that they're helping with. Many of the individuals, as one could imagine, are clinicians, over 70% actually, for VA research development. And as I mentioned, the academic affiliates aspect of this is really strong, and it brings the best of all healthcare, because we've got the advancements that are done or used within the general population, but it also brings into and looks at the unique issues that are dealt with for the veteran population. I think, what I wanted to bring up is where we're looking at the genomics program itself, and we have a lot of different pieces that we needed to look at. We wanted to develop, as one angle, develop and provide databases of medical and genomic data that we can understand better, uses of the records, as well as help with the establishment and understanding of diseases themselves. But one of our issues is that we do clinical trials, and we do want to have the access to the patient, him or herself as well. And the recruitment and collection of individuals as well as samples is time-consuming, costly, and difficult. And we want to have that clarity with the partnership of the veteran and the researcher to get the best healthcare so they can get it, and we have the ability to do good research works as well. From the genomic perspective, we wanted to also have the twist of understanding the genomic and phenotypic data in an analytical, standardized manner. These are expensive approaches. Certainly, they're dropping in price at this point, but it's when we were looking at this initially, when I came on, probably around 10 years ago, tests were expensive. much more expensive than they are now. And we wanted to have a way of getting this data done that one researcher set could look and identify information, and others could repurpose that data at some time in the future, understanding where it came from, what the standards were, and all that. And we also wanted to have the human subject and data protection that the veterans do desire. That is, the protection of their data so it does not get lost out into the ether, and somebody could use that nefariously against them, or to identify individuals in particular manners, for whatever the situations may be. But we also want to have the ability to, regardless of that, keep the data in such a way that we could then still look at what happens with these people throughout time. So a person could come into a study today, and 5 years later, we can find out what has actually happened and transpired vis-a-vis the genomic information that we have. And this is all aimed at trying to figure out what's the best way of finding results that could be implemented as tests that have some clinical utility and some clinical validity as well, ultimately helping the veteran population. The study that I'm predominantly talking about is this Million Veteran Program, which we're looking at bringing on 1 million veterans into this program. It started off in 2011. And currently we have around 670,000 individuals enrolled into this program. And the items that I illustrated earlier are taken into account. The way that we take the information, put samples in biorepository, have the information of the given individual and their health and lifestyle, and access to their medical record and the like. It's an ongoing program. If one is interested, this is the journal and publication that you want, well, the article that you want to take a look at. And we have roughly, at any given time, around 50 sites that are actively recruiting individuals into the program. And some of these areas you might be actually living next to. And it'd be interesting for you to get an understanding of what the program actually looks like, and if possible, participate if you are a veteran in using VHA for your healthcare service. If not, to at least spread the information to other veterans so they can partake in this work. Just as a general information panel, certainly we got predominantly males, but of the 9% females that we have, there are actually more females coming into MVP than are within VHA itself. Predominantly, these individuals are of the Korean War or Vietnam era, and most of the individuals are Caucasian, but there is a relatively large percentage of African Americans, Hispanic, and Native Americans as well. And the conflict, in service areas of conflict, certainly scan through different time frames, predominantly Vietnam era. Areas that we're looking at are, as noted on this slide, and they typically align with what VA is trying to help with the veteran population. We do have a lot of presentations within different places. American Society of Human Genetics had allowed us to present several abstracts and presentations there as well. And we also have an active component of not just looking at the genomic perspective, but also looking at how do we align these pieces with that other more, and actually probably more difficult area of trying to understand, which is the phenotyping. How do you actually look at the medical record data and be able to pull out unique values that might be then aligned with the genomic data to help and answer some of these questions. I'd just like to illustrate one piece that Larry and I are actually spearheading and with an individual by the name of Dave Oslin in Philadelphia, Prime Care, where we're looking at the implementation of looking at pharmacogenomic data and major depression, and see if one has this information from the pharmacogenomic perspective, how does the clinician, how does the patient take that into account? And is there actually validity and utility of these markers per se to help and identify which antidepressants one could or should or avoid in a given therapy of that unique individual that is there. Target number is for 2,000 individuals, around 20 academic sites, and looking at this as well. And it's developing interesting information, which I'm sure Dave Osland will bring up at some point in the future. I guess with that, I would like to ask Larry to continue with the presentation.
So thanks, Ron. This is Larry Meyer, or Laurence Meyer, and I've been in the VA as well as at an academic affiliate. So I'm one of those people that Ron mentioned, who's both at one of our academic institutions as well as been affiliated with the VA. And I practiced clinical genetics, and I was asked to start a clinical genetics program inside the VA about 8 years ago, and it's been building for the last 5 years. And while genetic care was available within the VA, there was really no organized nationwide structure. And so I've really been charged with trying to roll out the clinical operation of genetics and take all of the research that's been developed in the VA, and of course on the knowledge base of the Human Genome Project and the sequencing of the human genome and all of the other knowledge that has accrued over the last couple of decades. And I've got to say that just in the last 6 years that we've been very actively building this program, deciding on the standards of care is really a moving target. The knowledge that contributes to the practice of human genetics is expanding and continues to expand. So I just have a few slides describing the program that's been developed in the VA. And then I want to talk a little bit about the ways, the kinds of service that we give and the ways that we give it. So first, we are a service that gives most of the encounter by televideo link, and so the preponderance of these are done from our hub site, which is based in Salt Lake City, to a medical center, or even more commonly, one of the community-based outpatient clinics. And I don't know the background that all of you have about the VA, but we have over 170 VA medical centers or hospitals across the system, and these then have affiliated community-based outpatient clinics, or CBOCs, and we've got over 1,100 of those. So that's a system of almost 1,300 points of care that are nationwide. So this slogan that I adopted was that I want a veteran in rural Oklahoma or Montana or North Dakota, not to pick on any of those fine states, but I want them to get the same standard of care that they could get if they happen to be born in Palo Alto or Boston, or one of the hubs of genomic information. And the backbone of the VA televideo link and the VA's emphasis on telemedicine has really enabled this to be possible. So over half of our encounters, and then of course, we also use the telephone. You know, that's a given. And the second thing is the referrals come from everywhere. About a third of them come from our primary care clinics. A little over a quarter of them come from the women's health clinics, and that's due to the high rate of referral for breast ovarian cancer risk assessment. About 10% come from hematology oncology, and that's because of all of the other familial cancer syndromes. However, the rest come from every specialty in the entire VA, and that even includes the emergency department, where we've seen referrals because of conditions such as an abdominal aortic aneurysm, which we know can be familial. And so alert clinicians there, in taking a family history, called a consult immediately, and we were able to act on that. Over the last 5 or 6 years, our volume has steadily gone up. We're right now at over 80 VAs, and trying to get the ability to reach the rest. Ron showed the map of the sites where the MVP was recruiting. And I've got to say, with knowledge of that, we've actually tried to integrate with that program by making sure we provide clinical services where there might be a research enrollment push, because the presence of that research team asking veterans to participate often makes them think about a family history. And when they bring that up to their provider and say, you know, I've had a whole lot of this particular kind of cancer in my family, they'll then make a referral to us. I hope that can improve veteran care. I'll mention a little bit about the different kinds of care we give in a minute. But I think an important component of genetic care that doesn't come first to everybody's minds is the great mass of information. And I'm sorry, this slide, at least on my screen right now, it looks a little jumbled. It's been moved back and forth between different operating systems. But once a genetic test is run, there's a common perception that it's the gold standard. A genetic test will tell me everything I need to know and be definitive. And in fact, the massive information out of a modern sequence-based genetic test is huge and often very difficult to interpret. And while we clearly know some identified and identifiable and characterized mutations, and we can take those and diagnose the presence of a trait or a risk factor and correlate that with a clinical response, and we can then follow that up with a different clinical care. For example, recommending more frequent colonoscopies or more frequent breast exams or a specific therapy. It's often difficult to interpret the tests, and we see something that we've never seen before or only seen a few times. So it's necessary to have this information transmitted between our health systems and be available in the medical record at the point of care to the clinician. For example, if right now all genetic systems handle genetic data poorly, so across all of the best academic institutions in the country, there was a survey a couple of years ago, and they found that most of their genetic test results were either described as a text blob or a PDF, rather than integrated. So the VA has been a leader in an Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine effort that was termed Digitize, and now it's termed Genomics on Fire, spelled FIHR, for the electronic standard that's used to transmit this data, so that we can get it inserted in a structured fashion in the medical record, and then used for computerized decision support to remind a clinician that a test such as a colonoscopy is due, or to recommend for or against a certain drug, for example. And I think that's going to be necessary as we integrate these clinical results into our practice. If I can go back to one of Ron's slides, just to emphasize the scope of the VA. The corporate data warehouse rolls up all of the clinical data from all of these 1,300 points of care, and it's really been doing that for a little over 20 years that we've been having electronic medical records. So in total, there's about 22 million records, and having looked at it pretty closely, about 14 million of those have some rich clinical data in them. So not all of them. Some of them are primarily administrative records, about 10 million or so, 8 or 10 million. But in among those, you can look at the number of clinic notes, of lab orders, of radiology results. Those are in the billions. And that dwarfs the scope of any other clinical system in the world, I guarantee you. And so the combination of an integrated research effort to identify diseases and traits and treatments which are of potential benefit to veterans. And then, as I work closely with ORD, to roll those into the clinical practice and spread that rapidly across the nation, I think is unique in our healthcare systems and in any healthcare system. So we, to flash ahead here, I don't mean to make you busy with the slides. So the places we provide care are all the way across. We, of course, hope to reach all 1,300 points of care. And increasingly, we're starting to do a direct video to home. And that can be delivered on a computer, a laptop, an iPad kind of arrangement, or on a smartphone through a procedure called VA Video Connect. And the VA just obtained the authority to provide this care to a veteran's home across state lines because our veterans need that integration of nationwide care. And then finally, as I promised, a word of the kind of care we provide. 10 years ago, when I started, it was largely confined to individual expensive gene tests to address the risk for a very specific disease. And a lot of these tests were incomplete in that we knew one gene was involved, but we didn't know the others. Since I've been involved with the VA clinical effort, which is a little less than 10 years, we've gone from just over 1,000 diseases or genes mapped and associated and characterized as associated with the disease to over 6,000. And the technology that's used in the clinical diagnosis of disease has really matured, gotten much cheaper, and we now use something called massively parallel sequencing or next generation sequencing as a clinical test, sometimes if appropriate with a confirmation. And so we're using panel diagnoses and screening for disease risk much more efficiently and much more comprehensively. And we tend to apply those to the diseases where we know we can affect clinical outcomes by the knowledge that a person has a specific kind of genetic risk. And that's still the bulk of our practice. Depending on the disease and the risk factor and the assessment of the professional groups, we have different, we try to hold ourselves to exactly the same standard of care as would be practiced at any one of the major academic or cancer centers in the United States. And then we're obviously closely integrated with the practices of the services such as gastroenterology, oncology, mental health, as Ron already mentioned, and making sure that the clinical side feeds back so that we help research establish the priorities for their research direction. And then we also gobble up the results of research and try to make sure that we have the best information by which to guide our clinical decisions and the way we practice within the VA. So with that, I think we can turn it over to the panel discussion.
Dr. Meyer and Dr. Przegodzki for that informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your presentation window. Type your question into the box and that appears on your screen and click the Send button. We'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for. Let's get started. Our first question asks, how do I get into the VA healthcare system? Are there downside or advantages in doing so?
That's more in the clinical realm. Should I take that one, Ron?
Sure.
So there's a process for getting in, and there are eligibility requirements now. That has changed, and it will continue to change I know Congress is considering legislation. So you have to be eligible. And the way to go is to apply through the Veterans Benefits Administration at a regional office, or that's available at va.gov online. And it's now fully online. I don't think, or at least if there is a downside, I'm not aware of what that downside is. Many people that are eligible for VA care choose not to get it because they have, for example, their own employers covered plan, and they prefer to stay with those providers. There are a large number of eligible veterans that get one segment of their care from the VA and other segments in the community. And we call those the dependency on the VA. In some cases, we treat the veteran for a condition for which they're service connected. In other cases, they'll get much more of their health care here. And I think a lot of that choice can be regional. If a veteran lives close to a VA medical center or CBOC, they're much more likely to come to the VA. But I think the VA care, by a wide variety of studies, the Veterans Health Administration care, is on a par with that or better than the rest of the nation on most quality indicators. So even if somebody is registered, they don't need to get their care here. But if for any reason they lose their eligibility for other care, or they want to change doctors or get a second opinion, we're available.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is, can I solicit for a grant if I'm not in VA, especially with MVP?
I think I'll take that, Larry. So the point with VA research is that it is an intramural program. Being that one has, there are some rules for investigators that need to have done to be able to do any VA research itself. One of them is there's something called 5/8 time that you're at least on the VA payroll. That is 5/8 of your week of hours you are in a VA employee. And then that individual could, as a physician or as a clinician, apply for an intramural grant. Some of the programs, we have 4 major programs within research development, that being biomedical, clinical, rehabilitation, and health services. At least for biomedical, as I see at this point, we still have the need for quote unquote eligibility. That if one is a Ph.D. doctorate, strictly Ph.D. doctorate, one needs to go through eligibility to be able to apply for such merit grants. Certainly, there are a number of other ways that one could also work as an outside individual, and that is pairing with a VA researcher as an co-investigator and being able to go ahead and partake with the VA investigator in the works that are in VA itself, as well as within MVP. I'll also reflex to Larry, because Larry has been, until actually not that recently, the Associate Chief of Staff for Research within Utah, within Salt Lake City. And he has some ideas up his sleeve as well. I'm sure he'd be happy to share.
Yeah, so that's a question that I often got from my affiliates' family. So if you are at one of the roughly 120 academic centers that has a VA affiliate, there's a fairly easy pathway to get inside the VA. And while it's true you need to be 5/8 to receive VA funding to do research on the VA, you need not be 5/8 at the time of an application. So you can, if you're a clinician, it's possible to apply and then negotiate that time and effort if it's likely that you're going to be funded. There are differences between the different things. And then also, to be a member of a research team, you need not be at one of the major academic affiliates. So I had, under my coattails, as it were, people from 5 or 6 different states and all different academic kinds of institutions, and some private research facilities that would partner with the VA people and be able to carry on joint research projects. And I think they had to, of course, follow the standards of the VA for all data access, privacy and security, and our standards of conduct. But I think the VA, the recognition that we have basically 22 billion files in our electronic medical records and a genetic, the largest biobank in the world, and have a diverse clinical population is alluring as a place to do research. And I think the MVP, the Million Veteran Program that Ron talked a lot about, is going to prove to be one of the best genetic resources in the world for doing several different kinds of research. And we're actually interested in having a large number of people participate in that. We don't have all the best ideas in the world, and we know that. We've got good ideas, but in order to receive funding, you do have to be within the VA. And then there's the screen that the project has to benefit veterans' health, and it has to be aimed at a priority of the VA. That can be identified broadly, but we certainly have the areas about which we're most concerned: TBI, PTSD, and mental health, suicide, chronic diseases such as diabetes, renal failure, congestive heart failure, and that's a short list. But it needs to be relevant to the veteran population.
I think if I may interject, what's really interesting to note is we, like all federal agencies, have several surveys throughout the year about satisfaction and work environment and questions along those lines. And resoundingly, over 90% of the people, when they are polled, why are you within the VA? Why do you want to work here? And that the answer typically comes up as being to service the veteran. I challenge any other organization out there to go ahead and have such a high percentage focused on what you really are there for.
I'll add one other aspect of the VA that I don't think most people outside our system are as aware of as many of us inside, and actually we take it for granted. I've mentioned that there are 120 academic affiliates. The VA trains, in round numbers, 70% of all health providers in the United States at some point in their career. And that doesn't just mean doctors. That means physical therapists, nurses, social workers, the audiologists. It's a huge number of training programs in all of the health professions. And so the 3 missions of VHA, or 3 of the prime missions, are care of veterans, but education and research. And that also contributes to the employee satisfaction. Almost all of the internal medicine providers at my old home institution in the field were faculty at a major academic university and had time spent on both sides of the street, and the quality of care was really the same at the academic hospital and the VA. And that's another important mission.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question asks, what is the current role of clinical tests for disease susceptibility, such as cancer risk?
So I touched on that a little bit. I think for some diseases, we have very clearly defined standards. And so for the risk of breast cancer and ovarian cancer, we use different kinds of scoring systems based upon the age of onset and the family history, including the age of onset on relatives, to decide if it's appropriate to do a genetic test. In other cases, such as colon cancer, where in round numbers, 3% of the people with a colon cancer of any age have a genetic syndrome or family of syndromes called Lynch syndrome, or hereditary non-polyposis colon cancer. And that's contributed to by at least 4 major genes and is a chromosomal instability syndrome. And importantly, that both changes care, it results in screening of family members. It involves screening organs other than just the colon. And now we have interventions which can be specifically used for those cancers. So identification of this is important. So one of the standards that we use is, will it result in a change of medical care? And I broaden that because I think it's important for a person to know if they can transmit a disease to their family. That's often an important psychosocial reason to have a test. We also use it as it used to be. Once you thought there was a good chance of a condition, such as an adult onset neurological disease, we can perform iterative MRIs and try to diagnose something forever. But if we think we have a diagnosis and can diagnose it, then we can predict something about the course of the disease, even if we can't treat it. Other conditions where we commonly would apply tests are for some of the cardiac conduction defects and the cardiomyopathies. Again, they involve standards for different care. So those are really the kind of guidance we use in determining the appropriateness of a genetic test. I can say that in very round numbers, we perform a lab-based genetic test in about half the numbers. Now, in my view, as a clinician, the most important genetic test is a family history, personal and family history. Ron, on the other hand, is a pathologist, so he may differ from me a little bit. But, yeah.
It's kind of hard to get an answer from a tissue biopsy, but at least an answer of what is your family history like.
Yeah.
But what I can contribute is that when you can also look at the research perspective and how VA dovetails the research and the clinical pieces together. We looked at how do we actually approach Lynch syndrome? Is it actually ready for prime time? Can we move this out into the clinic? We had a couple of smaller studies just to get some baseline information. We also dovetailed with health services research, the group that actually looks at how do you push this information out and use this in some kind of a valid way within the clinic itself. And certainly there's some subsections within health services. There's the Quality Enhanced Research Initiative that Dr. Amy Kilborn moves and tries to get that bridge built between research and the clinic as well. And Lynch syndrome was one of those pieces that we decided that this is ready for prime time. We had the background and information, and Larry is the right person to put this all together and move this into the system. And here's the key thing I think that VA can and does do very well that I think some other healthcare systems might have a bit more difficulty, and that is a few people can come up with an idea, can move this and change the way the system is working throughout the entirety of VHA, or Veterans Healthcare Administration. That is key. That hardly ever happens anywhere else without infighting and difficulties in conversations and thinking. Here we think, we make a decision, we move ahead. And that's something that I'm personally really happy that we are capable of actually helping the veteran in such a relatively quick way. Would you agree, Larry?
Definitely.
Okay, we have time for just one more question today, and this last one asks, what about use of tests that test for which drug to use, pharmacogenomics?
So Ron mentioned the PRIME study. So I'll start. There's a tremendous push of pharmacogenomic testing companies now, which are trying to, appropriately sell their products, but saying that they can identify the best drug to use. And there's some clinical data. I can say that the VA looked at this, something called an evidence synthesis panel, which tried to do an analysis of published trials and determined that there really wasn't sufficient evidence. But let me back up a couple of steps and say that that is the goal of precision medicine. And I think most of us who are in this field say, we are hoping that we can, in the very near term, develop data that these will have improved outcomes. Now, there are places where pharmacogenomics is very clearly currently up to speed and where we're trying to roll it out as fast as we can in our system and in many other systems. And I'll give you several easy examples. One is something called abacavir hypersensitivity. This is a drug used for HIV therapy. And if you have a certain tissue type, an human leukocyte antigen, HLA type, it indicates that you're very high risk for having a serious life-threatening response if you take the medication. So even though that's quite rare, we think that should be used across the board. Another place where this is highly indicated is in some of the cancer therapy. This is getting a little bit wonky, but geneticists talk about two different kinds of genetic tests. One are tests of tissues, such as cancer tissue, which is we term somatic. It doesn't represent your whole body. It's one piece of your body that's different from the rest, as opposed to the germline tests, such as the test for disease susceptibility. And so in the realm of cancer genetics, there are now several dozen drugs which are targeted to a specific mutation. And we have an ongoing clinical program. Again, it's nationwide. It's also in my broad domain, called the Precision Oncology Program, or POP. And we basically take tumor tissue, sequence a large number of genes, in round numbers 200, and these are processed by different algorithms to identify whether they might have a mutation. And it's a low percentage, less than 10% of all tumors that we test have a hit where it suggests that it has a specific drug that would work. But that's important, because if you have one of those tumors, you want to know. And these drugs can be literally life-changing. They can turn the switch off on cancer. Similarly, for one of the cancers caused by Lynch syndrome, we now know that those are very susceptible to some of the new immunomodulators. So we are using these methods in common practice right now across the VA. In contrast, many of the panels that have been touted as being of great immediate benefit, we regard as being of potential benefit. And so Ron already mentioned that we're carrying on what I believe will be the largest pharmacogenomic trial in depression ever used, because that's the disease that is of specific interest to the VA. And we have hopes, but we do not yet know that it's actually going to improve. The problem with the tests that show drug metabolism, we can show that the presence of a given genetic variant might raise or lower the potential serum level of a drug, but that doesn't mean you're going to get better faster. And until we get to the point where we can say this is going to improve an outcome, I don't think it's really reasonable to use on a mass scale. We certainly do use all of these tests in clinical situations which the care can be individually difficult, but not across a clinic population. Ron, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. I think what's useful to also keep in mind is this is an evolving area. Both looking at the oncological perspective within research and development, as well as just the pharmacogenomic piece. I think it's worth noting that there was a gentleman in the 50s, Dr. Middleton, that discovered the connection between smoking and lung cancer, actually in rabbits at that point. And then I think about 2 or 3 years later, the Surgeon General from NIH basically has, or HHS has brought the point across that smoking is hazardous to your health. So VA, again, point number one. But it's an evolving area. And if you take into account the pharmacogenomic piece, we really don't know enough about how all of these pathways are interworking as well. Think about it this way. Every individual is truly unique, especially with the pharmacogenomic pieces. On top of that, what is the other overlying things that modulate the metabolism? Could it be the typical grapefruit juice? Grapefruit juice? Is it the issues of eating a lot of leafy greens because now you're changing your vitamin K and other aspects there? Is there an augmentation because you smoke? All of these have effects on some of the pharmacogenomic pathways as well. But I think with the PRIME study, one key thing that we're looking at is what does the patient and the physician actually do when they get this information? Everybody hears about a lot of different companies that will give you genetic data and you can find out wonderful things where you come from and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is there a utility to this? Do we really know that once I find out that I have this chance of getting, well, what is the real incidence that could follow with this? And that's, I think, the question of the day. People are interested in finding out a little bit more about themselves. But other than that, is there really a piece? I think I just wanted to add one other point, that when you look at the pharmacogenomic aspects for VHA, or Veterans Health Administration piece of use of these tests, we, Larry and I and a number of other individuals have actually a manuscript out, should be coming out in Genetics and Medicine, looking at our recommendations for VHA healthcare and pharmacogenomics.
I would like to once again thank Dr. Meyer and Dr. Przygodzki for their presentation. Before we go, I want to let everyone know that today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through September 2018. You'll receive an email from LabRoots letting you know when this webcast will be available for replay. Please share that announcement with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. That's all for now. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.